Imagine standing on the deck of a wooden warship somewhere in the cold, gray waters of the North Atlantic. The year is 1812. The wind is howling. The ocean swells rise and fall like the breathing of some ancient, indifferent god. And somewhere out there, cutting through the fog, is an enemy vessel. Guns loaded, crew at battle stations, flying the flag of the most powerful navy the world has ever seen. The British Royal Navy, the force that defeated Napoleon's fleets, the force that ruled every ocean on the planet. And you, aboard a young American frigate, are about to go head-to-head with them. Not run, not hide, fight. What happens next will change the course of naval history forever, create one of the most legendary nicknames in military lore, and prove to the entire watching world that the United States of America was not a nation to be taken lightly. This is the story of the USS Constitution versus the HMS Guerriere. This is the story of old Ironsides. To truly understand what happened on August 19, 1812, you cannot simply look at the battle itself. You have to go back. You have to understand the world that created these two ships, the men who sailed them, and the enormous political and military stakes that rode on every single cannon shot fired that afternoon. Because this was not just a naval engagement. This was a statement. This was a declaration written not in ink, but in gunpowder and iron. Let us begin with the USS Constitution herself. She was born out of necessity, out of fear, and out of fierce national pride. The year was 1794. The United States of America was barely a decade old as a functioning constitutional republic. The ink on the Constitution, the document, not the ship, was still practically fresh. George Washington was president, and the young nation faced a crisis that threatened its very economic survival. Pirates, specifically the Barbary pirates of North Africa, operating out of ports in Algiers, Tripoli, and Tunis, were raiding American merchant vessels in the Mediterranean with terrifying regularity. They were capturing American sailors, enslaving them, holding them for ransom. And the United States could do absolutely nothing about it, because the United States had no navy. None. After the Revolutionary War, Congress had disbanded the Continental Navy to save money. It seemed reasonable at the time. It seemed catastrophic in hindsight. Congress responded with the Naval Act of 1794, authorizing the construction of 6 frigates. These would not be ordinary frigates. The man tasked with designing them was a Philadelphia shipbuilder and naval architect named Joshua Humphreys. And Humphreys had a vision that was radical for its time. He understood that America could not afford to build a full fleet of ships of the line, those massive, multi-decked warships that were the battleships of the age. Ships of the line required enormous resources, enormous crews, and enormous expense. But a standard frigate wasn't powerful enough to take on a British ship of the line either. So Humphreys designed something in between, something unprecedented. He designed heavy frigates, ships that were larger, stronger, and more heavily armed than any conventional frigate in any navy in the world, yet still fast enough to outrun anything they couldn't outfight. It was a revolutionary concept, and the USS Constitution would be the jewel of that revolutionary fleet. Her keel was laid in Edmund Hart's shipyard in Boston, Massachusetts, in November of 1794. The timber used in her construction was extraordinary. Her live oak frame, and live oak is one of the densest, hardest woods found in North America, came largely from Gascoigne Bluff on St. Simon's Island in Georgia. Live oak was chosen specifically for its incredible resistance to cannon shot. When a cannonball strikes live oak, it does not penetrate cleanly the way it does softer wood. It compresses, it deflects, it sometimes shatters against the grain of the wood itself. Her hull planking was made of white oak, her decks of hard pine. The copper fastenings and copper sheathing on her hull below the waterline were supplied by none other than Paul Revere. Yes, that Paul Revere, from his foundry in Canton, Massachusetts. Every detail of her construction reflected the most advanced naval engineering thinking of the era. Under British command, the Guerriere served in the Atlantic and eventually found herself on the North American station, the naval command responsible for British naval operations along the eastern seaboard of North America and in the waters of the Western Atlantic. It was here, in these waters, that she would develop a particularly provocative habit. The Guerriere's captain and crew were, like much of the Royal Navy, utterly contemptuous of American naval power. Britain had just finished dealing with Napoleon's combined Franco-Spanish fleet at Trafalgar in 1805, sending that threat to the bottom of the sea in one of the most decisive naval victories in history. The Royal Navy had over 600 ships in commission. The American Navy had, by comparison, a handful. The British attitude toward American sea power was somewhere between amusement and active disdain, and the Guerriere's crew expressed this disdain in a particularly theatrical way. They painted the words, "Not the Little Belt," on the Guerriere's hull in large letters, a taunt directed at Americans, referencing an incident in 1811 when the USS President had engaged and badly damaged the British sloop HMS Little Belt in a case of mistaken identity. The British were furious about that engagement. The Guerriere's message was essentially, "We are not a small sloop. We are a warship of the Royal Navy, and we are not afraid of you." The provocations extended beyond paint on a hull. The Guerriere and other Royal Navy vessels operating in American coastal waters continued the deeply inflammatory British practice of impressment, stopping American merchant vessels and removing sailors they claimed were British subjects and pressing them into service aboard Royal Navy ships. This practice, more than almost any other single issue, inflamed American public opinion and drove the United States toward war. By 1812, the tensions had reached a breaking point. The United States, under President James Madison, was being squeezed from multiple directions. The British were interfering with American trade with France. The British were arming Native American tribes on the western frontier who were resisting American expansion. The British were impressing American sailors. And a faction in Congress known as the War Hawks, led by figures like Henry Clay of Kentucky and John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, were pushing aggressively for war. On June 18, 1812, President Madison signed the declaration of war against Great Britain. The War of 1812 had begun. The reaction in Britain was, to put it mildly, underwhelmed. The British government and press greeted the American declaration of war with something approaching contempt. They had a real war to fight against Napoleon. What threat could this upstart republic with its tiny navy possibly pose? The London Times famously declared that the American Navy was so inferior to the British that it would be swept from the seas in a matter of weeks. American frigates were considered no match for the battle-hardened veterans of Trafalgar. The general expectation was that the Royal Navy would quickly establish a blockade of the American coast, strangle American trade, and that would be the end of that. There was very little genuine alarm in British naval circles about the prospect of fighting the Americans at sea. Now let us understand the men who would command these ships on August 19, 1812. On the American side, commanding the USS Constitution, was Captain Isaac Hull. Hull was a Connecticut-born naval officer, 39 years old in 1812, stocky and energetic, deeply experienced in naval affairs, and intensely patriotic. He had served in the Navy since 1798, had seen action in the Quasi-War and in the Mediterranean, and had worked his way up through the ranks through competence, courage, and careful professionalism. He was not a glamorous figure in the mold of some naval heroes. He was no reckless daredevil seeking glory at any cost. He was a competent, thorough, serious officer who understood his ship, understood his crew, and understood his duty. Hull had taken command of the Constitution in the spring of 1812, replacing William Bainbridge, and he had spent the weeks immediately before the battle in a remarkable display of seamanship that had already made him famous before the engagement with the Guerriere even occurred. Just weeks before the battle, in late July, Hull had sailed the Constitution out of the Chesapeake Bay and almost immediately encountered a British squadron of 5 ships, a ship of the line, several frigates, and smaller vessels. For 66 hours, Hull had used every trick in the seamanship handbook to escape. He kedged his ship forward by rowing anchors ahead of her and pulling the ship up to them, effectively dragging her forward when the winds died. He used his ship's boats to tow her. He wet his sails to make them hold more wind. He pumped water overboard to lighten her. He used every fraction of breeze, every shift in the weather, with extraordinary skill. He escaped. He reached Boston a hero before he'd even fought a battle. The escape from the British squadron had demonstrated to the American public that the officers of their navy were men of exceptional ability, and it had given his crew an enormous boost of confidence and cohesion. They had been tested together, they had succeeded together, and they believed in their captain. On the British side, commanding the HMS Guerriere, was Captain James Richard Decaurs. Decaurs was 28 years old in 1812, young even by the standards of an era when men commanded warships in their 20s. He came from a distinguished naval family. His father was Vice Admiral James Decaurs. He had entered the Royal Navy as a child, as was the custom, and had grown up at sea. He was considered a capable officer by the standards of the Royal Navy of his time. He was confident, as most Royal Navy officers were confident in this period, with a confidence bred of the Navy's extraordinary record of success over the previous 2 decades. He had served on the Guerriere since 1811 and knew his ship well. But that confidence, that absolute, unquestioned certainty in British naval superiority that pervaded the Royal Navy officer corps, would prove to be a liability on August 19, 1812. There is a famous story, possibly apocryphal but widely repeated at the time, that Decaurs was so confident in his ship's ability to defeat any American vessel that he had actually written a challenge of sorts, wagering a hat with American naval officers that the Guerriere could beat any comparable American frigate in single combat. Whether this story is precisely accurate in its details or not, it captures something true about the attitude of British naval officers in this period. They simply did not believe that American ships or American officers could stand against them in an equal fight. This belief was not entirely without basis. The Royal Navy had an extraordinary record and genuinely experienced, battle-hardened officers and crews. But it led to a dangerous underestimation of the opponent. The Constitution left Boston on August 2, 1812, with orders from Navy Secretary Paul Hamilton to cruise in search of enemy vessels and to protect American commerce. Hull sailed northeast, toward the waters off Nova Scotia and Newfoundland, where British merchant shipping and naval vessels were known to operate. He was looking for a fight, a deliberate, calculated fight that could demonstrate American naval capability and boost the nation's morale in the early, uncertain days of the war. Meanwhile, the Guerriere was operating in the same general area. Decaurs had been ordered to cruise in the waters south of Newfoundland and had been doing so for weeks. His ship needed maintenance. She was due for a refit, and Decaurs was intending to make for Halifax, Nova Scotia, for that purpose. His crew was somewhat depleted, with a few men detached for service elsewhere, and he had some replacements who were less experienced than he might have wished. The Guerriere was not in perfect fighting trim, but Decaurs was not particularly worried. He was a captain of the Royal Navy in command of a British frigate. That was enough. August 19, 1812, the day of decision. The morning broke with moderate winds and a rolling sea in the waters roughly 400 to 600 miles southeast of Halifax, in the open North Atlantic. The Constitution was cruising on an eastward heading. At approximately 2 o'clock in the afternoon, a sail was spotted from the masthead. Hull immediately altered course toward it. The approaching vessel was the Guerriere, sailing southwest, her sails set to the wind, moving steadily through the Atlantic swells. As the two ships drew closer, both captains assessed the situation. Through his telescope, Deckers could see the approaching American frigate clearly enough to identify her general type, if not her precise identity. He had no particular reason for concern. He cleared his ship for action, moved his crew to battle stations, loaded his guns, rolled aside the mess tables and sea chests that filled the gun deck in normal operations, wetted the decks with sand to give the gun crews traction, prepared buckets of water and the surgeon's instruments below decks in the cockpit, and readied his vessel for combat. He was confident. He was ready. On the Constitution, the same preparations were underway, but with a different emotional texture. Hull's crew was experienced, confident from their recent escape, and keenly aware of what this moment meant. They were about to fight a Royal Navy frigate in single combat, the thing that American naval officers had dreamed of and argued about for years, the test that would answer the burning question: could Americans actually fight the British at sea? Hull walked the gun deck, speaking to his men, encouraging them. He reminded them of what was at stake, not just their own lives, but the reputation of their country, the honor of their flag, the dignity of their nation. The gun crews checked their powder charges, their shot, their flints. The Marines, sharpshooters who would fire from the tops and the rails, checked their muskets and cartridges. The Constitution bore down on the Guerriere with steady, purposeful momentum. The two ships began their approach on diverging headings, then parallel, then gradually converging. The Guerriere fired first, a ranging shot, then a broadside at long range, testing the distance and assessing the Constitution's response. The shots splashed into the sea or struck the Constitution's hull with audible thuds. And here, something happened that would pass into legend. A sailor on the Constitution's deck, watching British cannonballs strike the ship's hull and bounce away, is reported to have cried out something along the lines of "her sides are made of iron," or words to that effect. Historians have debated the precise origin of the nickname Old Ironsides, whether it came from this exact moment, from this specific sailor, or whether it emerged more gradually in the aftermath of the battle from multiple accounts and retellings. But what is undeniable is that the nickname stuck, and the phenomenon it described was real. British cannonballs were striking the Constitution and bouncing off. The dense live oak of her hull, the thickness of her construction, was defeating British iron. Hull was exercising extraordinary patience during this approach. He could feel the tension of his crew, men at the guns, hands tied on the lanyards, watching the enemy ship fire and reload, watching their own ship absorb punishment without answering. Hull withheld his fire. He wanted to get close. He wanted to be so close that when the Constitution's massive guns spoke, they would speak with maximum devastating effect. He reportedly walked the deck shouting to his gun captains, urging them to hold, to wait, to be patient. Some accounts suggest he was so caught up in the tension that he split his breeches, a detail that became one of the more colorful footnotes in American naval history. Then, at a distance of roughly 50 to 60 yards, pistol shot range, as it was called, because you could theoretically shoot a pistol from one ship and hit someone on the other, Hull gave the order. "Now, boys, pour it into them." The Constitution's port broadside erupted. 24-pound shot and 32-pound carronade balls, an enormous weight of metal, smashed into the Guerriere at close range with tremendous, catastrophic force. The effect was devastating. The Guerriere's hull shook. Timber flew. Men were hurled from their feet or cut down by the iron hail. And the ships continued to exchange broadsides at terrifyingly close range, the crews working their guns with frantic, professional speed, the smoke of discharge billowing in clouds around both vessels, the noise beyond description to anyone who has not stood on the deck of a fighting ship in action. Within the first 15 minutes of serious close engagement, The Guerriere lost her mizzenmast, the rearmost mast on a three-masted ship, to a concentrated barrage from the Constitution's guns. The mizzenmast went over the side and dragged in the water alongside the hull, acting as a sea anchor and making the Guerriere difficult to maneuver, pulling her around and exposing her stern and bow to enemy fire rather than allowing her to keep her broadside guns bearing on the enemy. This was a serious wound. Hull saw it immediately and pressed his advantage. The two ships fell together in the smoke and confusion, their sides almost touching, and in this brief, chaotic moment, the gun crews on both vessels were firing almost directly into each other at point-blank range, the muzzles of the guns practically touching the enemy hull. It was the most concentrated, murderous kind of naval combat possible. Men were dying on both gun decks. The screaming of the wounded mixed with the thunder of the guns and the crashing of timber. The ships ground against each other, then separated as the swell pushed them apart. In the collision, the Guerriere's bowsprit became entangled briefly with the Constitution's mizzen rigging, and this tangling produced a terrifying moment where both ships were locked together at the bow and stern, the waves working them against each other, and boarding parties were called away on both sides. Men with cutlasses and pistols preparing to leap across to the enemy's deck in the most savage, personal kind of combat. The boarding moment passed without a full engagement as the ships separated, but the close-range exchange had done catastrophic damage to the Guerriere. She was taking water. Her gun crews were suffering terrible casualties. Her deck was littered with dead and wounded. And then her foremast, already damaged, came down under fire, and as it fell, it brought the mainmast down with it, the whole mass of timber and rigging crashing into the sea alongside the hull, leaving the Guerriere a helpless, rolling wreck, completely unable to maneuver, completely unable to fight effectively, wallowing in the Atlantic swells with 3 feet of water in her hold, and her crew struggling desperately to manage the damage. The entire close engagement, from the first serious exchange of broadsides to this decisive moment, had lasted perhaps 30 minutes, maybe less. The Guerriere was finished. Decours, wounded himself. A musket ball had grazed his back, surveyed the wreckage of his command. His ship was sinking. He had no means of escape, no means of continued resistance that would serve any purpose beyond adding to the already grievous list of dead and wounded. He made the only decision that the circumstances permitted and that honor allowed in such a situation. He ordered the colors struck. The Guerriere surrendered. Hull sent his first lieutenant, Charles Morris, himself wounded during the battle, over to the Guerriere in a boat to accept the surrender formally. Morris found a scene of absolute devastation on the British frigate's decks. The Guerriere had suffered approximately 78 casualties, 23 killed and 56 wounded, with some sources giving slightly different figures. Among the dead were several midshipmen and junior officers who had been serving at the guns when the Constitution's broadsides swept their deck. The Constitution had fared remarkably better, approximately 14 casualties total, with 7 killed and 7 wounded. The disparity in casualties tells the story of the engagement more clearly than any words can. The Constitution had been more accurate, more powerful, more effectively handled. There was a poignant moment when Decours was rowed across to the Constitution to formally surrender his sword to Hull. According to the accounts that Hull himself preserved and that became part of American naval tradition, Hull declined to accept Decours' sword, saying that he could not take the sword of a brave man. Whether those precise words were spoken or whether this represents a romanticized retelling that grew with time, the sentiment it expresses captures something true about the code of honor under which naval officers of this era operated. They were enemies, yes, but they were also professionals who understood and respected courage under fire. Decours had fought his ship to the point of complete incapacity. He had been outnumbered in weight of broadside, outbuilt in the quality of his opponent's hull, and ultimately outfought. but he had not surrendered without fighting. The Guerriere was so badly damaged that there was no possibility of saving her as a prize. Hull's officers assessed her condition and found that she was beyond repair in the open ocean. She was on fire and taking on water faster than pumps could manage. The decision was made to remove all the prisoners, the British survivors, to the Constitution and to blow up the Guerriere. After all the British wounded and survivors had been transferred, the remaining crew set charges and the Guerriere was destroyed. She went down in the North Atlantic, a burning wreck, taking with her the physical evidence of British naval invincibility. On August 30th, 1812, Hull brought the Constitution into Boston Harbor. The news had preceded him, and the reaction was extraordinary. America exploded with joy, and this is not an exaggeration. The country desperately needed good news. The early land campaign of the war had been a disaster. General William Hull, the captain's uncle, had just surrendered Detroit to the British and their native allies without fighting, and humiliation that had sent shockwaves through the American public. The war on land seemed to be going badly. And then this. An American frigate had met a British frigate in single combat and had defeated it decisively, quickly, and with far fewer casualties. The symbolic power of this victory was immense, far beyond the military significance of losing one British frigate. It proved that American naval officers could fight. It proved that American sailors could match the best the Royal Navy had to offer. It proved that the Royal Navy was not invincible. Boston erupted in celebration. Bells rang. Ships in the harbor fired salutes. Crowds gathered on the wharves and cheered as the Constitution came in. Hull and his officers were feted at dinners and celebrations. Congress voted gold medals for Hull and his officers and awarded prize money to the crew. Poems were written. Songs were composed. The name Old Ironsides spread through the press and public conversation with extraordinary speed, attaching itself permanently to the Constitution as a symbol of American toughness and resilience. Isaac Hull became a national hero almost overnight. In Britain, the reaction was one of shock and disbelief, followed rapidly by indignation and the scrambling for explanations. The Times of London, which had so recently dismissed the American Navy with contempt, now thundered that the result was inexplicable and unacceptable. British naval officers and commentators worked hard to explain away the defeat. The Guerriere had been undermanned, they said. She was overdue for a refit. She was in poor condition. Captain Deckers had been unlucky. The Americans had been fortunate. The size difference between the ships was raised, and this was actually a legitimate point. The Constitution was, by standard rating measurements, a 44-gun frigate, while the Guerriere was a 38-gun frigate. But the rating system of the era was somewhat misleading, and the actual weight of broadside each ship could deliver was the more meaningful measure. The Constitution could throw approximately 736 pounds of iron per broadside. The Guerriere could throw approximately 556 pounds. This was a significant advantage, but it was not the overwhelming mismatch that later British excuses sometimes suggested. The Constitution was a better ship, commanded by a better prepared captain, with a better drilled crew, and she won decisively. What the British explanations and excuses could not fully account for was the quality of American gunnery. American naval gunnery in this period was, by the evidence of this and subsequent engagements, genuinely excellent, more accurate and more rapid than British gunnery of comparable vessels. There are several reasons for this. One is that American naval vessels, being far fewer in number than British ones, received more individual attention to training and preparation. American captains like Hull drilled their crews repeatedly and intensely. The Constitution's crew had been drilling with their guns throughout the cruise that led to this engagement. Another reason is that American naval officers were meritocratic in a way that the Royal Navy, still heavily influenced by patronage and aristocratic preference, sometimes was not. The best American officers rose through ability, and they brought that meritocratic sensibility to the training and management of their crews. Whatever the precise reasons, American gunnery was lethal, and it was a decisive factor in this battle and in the remarkable string of American single-ship victories that followed in the first year of the war. The Battle of August 19, 1812, did not win the War of 1812 for the United States. The war itself was long, complex, and ultimately ended in something closer to a draw than a clear victory for either side, with the Treaty of Ghent in December 1814 essentially restoring the pre-war status quo on most of the contested issues. The impressment issue, one of the primary American grievances that had helped drive the country to war, was not even formally resolved in the treaty, because Napoleon's defeat in Europe meant that Britain no longer needed to impress sailors on the scale it had before, and the practice simply faded in practical significance. The war on land had seen both triumphs and disasters, including the burning of Washington, D.C., by British forces in 1814 and the astonishing American victory at the Battle of New Orleans in January 1815, a battle fought, ironically, 2 weeks after the peace treaty had been signed, because news traveled slowly in the age before telegraph or radio. But the naval war, and particularly the series of remarkable single-ship victories in its first year, had profound and lasting consequences. The Constitution's victory over the Guerriere was followed by other American successes, the USS United States capturing the HMS Macedonian in October 1812, the Constitution again under Captain William Bainbridge defeating the HMS Java in December 1812, and others. These victories did not fundamentally alter the strategic balance of the naval war. The Royal Navy was simply too large and too powerful for the tiny American Navy to challenge on a fleet level, and by 1813 and 1814, the British blockade of the American coast was increasingly strangling American trade and commerce. But the symbolic and diplomatic impact of these victories was enormous. They forced the British government and Navy to take the American challenge seriously in a way they had not before. They demanded changes in Royal Navy tactics and approach. The British began pairing frigates to avoid single-ship engagements with American heavy frigates, which was itself an acknowledgement of American capability. They boosted American morale at critical moments when the land war was providing little to celebrate. And they established a tradition of excellence in the American Navy that would shape American naval culture for generations to come. The Constitution herself went on to have an extraordinary career that extended far beyond the War of 1812. She fought in the Second Barbary War in 1815. She served as a training ship and a diplomatic vessel in subsequent decades. She was periodically refitted and repaired as the years accumulated damage and wear. And then, in 1830, she faced a threat that no British broadside had been able to deliver: the threat of destruction at American hands. A report in the Boston Advertiser claimed that a Navy Department survey had found the Constitution to be beyond economical repair and recommended that she be broken up for scrap. The public reaction was immediate and intense. Oliver Wendell Holmes, then a young man of 21, was so moved that he wrote a poem that became one of the most famous American poems of the 19th century, and that quite literally saved the ship. Holmes published Old Ironsides in the Boston Daily Advertiser on September 16, 1830. The poem is a passionate, emotional appeal not to destroy the old ship, not to let her sink beneath the wave, but if she must die, to let her die in battle. Nail to the mast her holy flag, set every threadbare sail, and give her to the god of storms, the lightning and the gale. The poem was reprinted in newspapers across the country. It generated an outpouring of public sentiment so overwhelming that the Navy Department reversed its decision. The Constitution would be saved, repaired, preserved. She is still preserved today, the oldest commissioned warship afloat in the world, berthed at the Charlestown Navy Yard in Boston, Massachusetts, a living monument to the men and the moment we have been discussing. Captain Isaac Hull went on to a distinguished further career in the Navy, commanding various naval stations and serving in multiple capacities until his death in 1843. He never again commanded in a major sea battle. His moment of supreme glory was August 19, 1812, and he knew it, and he wore that achievement with quiet, steady pride for the rest of his life. He was never the most famous American naval hero of the War of 1812. That title would probably go to Oliver Hazard Perry for his victory on Lake Erie in 1813. But among professionals, among those who understood the sea and its demands, Hull's handling of the Constitution in the engagement with the Guerriere was recognized as a masterwork of seamanship and gunnery. Captain James Deckers faced a court-martial, as any Royal Navy captain who lost his ship was required to do. Courts-martial in such cases were not necessarily punitive. They were investigations intended to establish the facts and determine whether proper professional conduct had been observed. Deckers's court-martial, held in Halifax in September 1812, heard the evidence, considered the circumstances, and honorably acquitted him of any blame. The court found that the loss of the Guerriere was due to the superior force and weight of the enemy, not to any failure of duty or courage on Deckers's part. He was returned to duty, given another command, and continued his naval career. He eventually rose to the rank of admiral. He lived until 1853. One imagines that the memory of August 19, 1812, never entirely left him. The day when the world's most powerful navy learned that it had underestimated its opponent. The broader lessons of the Constitution versus Guerriere engagement have been studied and discussed by naval historians, military analysts, and students of leadership and strategy ever since. There are several that stand out with particular clarity across the distance of more than 2 centuries. The first is the importance of purpose-built quality over quantity. Joshua Humphreys's vision of a small number of exceptionally capable ships proved its worth decisively on that August afternoon. The Constitution was not just another frigate. She was a leap forward in naval design, and that leap forward translated directly into victory. The second lesson is the danger of overconfidence. The Royal Navy's absolute certainty in its own superiority had bred a complacency that, in this particular engagement, proved fatal to one ship and enormously costly to British prestige. Deckers fought well, but he went into the engagement with a mindset that did not fully respect what he was fighting. Hull, by contrast, respected the danger completely and prepared accordingly. The third lesson is the decisive importance of crew training and gunnery accuracy. Ships are only as good as the people who sail them. The Constitution won not just because she was bigger and better built, but because her crew put iron on target with speed and precision that overwhelmed their opponent. Preparation, drilling, training, these are not glamorous things, but they win battles. The fourth lesson, perhaps the most profound in its implications, is about national will and the meaning of symbolic victories. The Constitution's defeat of the Guerriere did not win the War of 1812, but it changed what Americans believed was possible. It changed what the British believed they were dealing with. It inserted doubt into the minds of those who had assumed that American pretensions to naval power were simply a joke. In warfare, as in many other human endeavors, what people believe about themselves and their opponents matters enormously. The Battle of August 19, 1812, changed belief and changed history. Today, the USS Constitution still floats in Boston Harbor. She is, as noted, the oldest commissioned warship afloat in the world. She still carries her commission in the United States Navy. She is still technically an active-duty vessel, with a crew of active-duty sailors from the Navy who serve aboard her as her caretakers and guides. Periodically, on special occasions, on her own anniversaries, she is taken out into Boston Harbor and sailed under her own canvas, a ghost from another age moving through modern waters, reminding those who watch her of what she was, what she did, and what she means. Visitors can tour her at the Charlestown Navy Yard, can walk her gun deck, see her massive cannons, touch the wood of her hull, and stand in the space where, in the first year of a forgotten war, American sailors proved to the world that their young nation had the courage and the capability to fight for what it believed in. The HMS Guerriere is long gone, her wreckage scattered somewhere on the floor of the North Atlantic, her timbers dissolved by 2 centuries of cold salt water. She lives now only in historical records, in paintings and engravings of the battle, in the memory of the engagement she lost. There is a certain poignancy in that, a ship named the Warrior, built to fight, captured from one navy and pressed into service in another, sent to the bottom of the ocean on a summer afternoon in 1812 as the price of a nation's education and humility. She was a fine ship, sailed by capable men, and she was beaten by a better ship, better handled, on that particular day. History is sometimes simple in its final verdicts, even when the road to them is complicated. The story of Old Ironsides is, at its core, a story about preparation meeting opportunity. Isaac Hull had spent months drilling his crew. Joshua Humphreys had spent years designing his masterpiece. The shipwrights of Boston had spent years building her with the finest materials available. Paul Revere's copper sheathed her below the waterline. The live oaks of Georgia armored her sides. The ambitions and anxieties of a young republic were invested in her timbers and her canvas. And on August 19, 1812, all of that preparation, all of that investment, all of that national will, encountered its moment and rose to meet it. We remember this battle for the same reason we remember any great clash between determined opponents in a just cause. Not only because of who won and who lost, not only because of the strategic consequences, but because of what it reveals about human beings under pressure, the capacity for courage, the price of arrogance, the reward of preparation, and the enduring power of a symbol. Old Ironsides. Her sides are made of iron. More than 200 years later, she still is. If you have never stood on her gun deck, I encourage you to go to Boston and do so. Stand where Hull stood. Stand where those gun crews stood, loading and firing into the smoke and the thunder. Feel the wood under your feet, the harbor wind on your face, and remember what was won and what was proven on a summer afternoon in the North Atlantic, in the first year of a war that forged an American identity at sea that has endured to this day. This has been the story of the USS Constitution versus the HMS Guerriere, the Battle of Old Ironsides. Thank you for spending this time exploring this piece of history with us. Naval history is not just the story of ships and guns and tactics. It is the story of human beings making decisions under extreme pressure, of nations defining themselves through conflict, of moments that seem, in the long view of time, to have been inevitable, but which in the actual moment hung on 1,000 contingencies. A shift in wind, a well-aimed gun, a captain's patience at the crucial second. It is the story of the world we inherited, shaped by men who sailed wooden ships into iron storms and came home changed, or didn't come home at all. And now, a question for you. Knowing everything about this battle, the superior design of the Constitution, the experience and training of Hull's crew, the dangerous overconfidence of the Royal Navy in this period, do you believe the outcome was inevitable? Or do you think that with different decisions, different preparations, or different circumstances, the Guerriere could have won? Was Old Ironsides destined for glory, or did glory find her through 1,000 choices made right? Leave your answer in the comments below. And if you found value in this deep dive into naval history, please subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss our next exploration of the battles, the ships, and the extraordinary human beings who have shaped the history of warfare at sea.